Sergeant Oakes, turn around. We need to talk about the battalion checkbook.
The checkbook? What do you mean? Why would you be asking me about that?
This is Andrew Oakes, a staff sergeant trusted to manage his battalion's finances at Catterick Garrison. He operated without meaningful oversight for nearly 3 years, and £336,000 of public defense money disappeared before anyone checked.
28 cheques, Sergeant, made out to yourself.
He would not talk his way out of this one. The men at the door of his Winsford home were not colleagues from the battalion. They were investigators from the Ministry of Defence's Economic Crime Team, and they already had the numbers. £336,448, 28 government checks, 3 Teslas parked outside, a pre-signed military checkbook that Andrew Oakes had used for nearly a year to pay himself. Before we get into exactly how a serving British Army Staff Sergeant emptied his own battalion's checkbook into his personal account, I want to ask you something. Would you notice if the colleague you trusted with your unit's finances suddenly started rolling up to work in a brand new Tesla? Drop your honest answer in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. We break down cases like this every single week, and this story has details that never made it into the papers. Andrew Oakes was born in 1985 in Winsford, a market town in Cheshire built on rock salt, railway sidings, and the Weaver navigation. His father was a warehouse supervisor at a logistics firm off the A54. His mother worked reception at a local GP surgery. There was nothing about the family that hinted at the driveway of luxury cars he would one day park outside a rented terrace. He grew up in a semi-detached council house on the Wharton estate, the younger of 2 boys. Neighbors later told local reporters that Andrew was the polite one, the quiet one, the boy who kept his shoes clean and did his homework at the kitchen table. He attended Winsford Verdon Academy, where his reports described him as, quote, capable but underachieving, with a strong aptitude for numbers. He left at 16 with a handful of GCSEs, worked briefly at a Tesco distribution center, and by the summer of 2004, he was standing in front of an Army careers advisor in Chester, asking about the Adjutant General's Corps. The recruiter's notes described him as, quote, presentable, articulate, methodical, well-suited to a clerical trade within the Corps. He passed selection at Pirbright and was posted to the Defense School of Finance and Management for Phase 2 training. He was 19 years old. His first substantive posting was to a light infantry battalion in Germany, working in the pay office. He was, by every account, unremarkable in the best way. He turned up on time. His paperwork was clean. When soldiers came in furious about a missing overseas allowance or a botched tax code, Lance Corporal Oakes was the man who calmed them down and fixed it before end of business. He was promoted to corporal in 2011, to sergeant in 2017, and to staff sergeant in 2022. Each promotion board noted the same qualities: methodical, discreet, trustworthy with sensitive information. One report described him as, quote, a safe pair of hands in a trade where safe pairs of hands are the entire point. In late 2022, he was posted to the 2nd Infantry Training Battalion at Catterick Garrison in North Yorkshire as the unit's financial systems administrator. The judge later would call it a prestigious appointment. Inside the Corps, it was known as one of the higher trust finance billets a staff sergeant could hold. He was 37 years old and, on paper, exactly the kind of soldier the Army had trained him to be. By that point, he had a mortgage application in draft, a growing interest in electric cars, and a small but noticeable habit of talking about money he did not actually have. To understand what Andrew Oakes did, you have to understand what he was trusted with. The 2nd Infantry Training Battalion at Catterick Garrison is one of the largest training establishments in the British Army. Thousands of soldiers pass through basic and Phase 2 training there every year. It employs civilian contractors, tailoring firms, catering companies, transport suppliers, and dozens of regimental accountants and clerks. Every one of those relationships involves money moving out of Ministry of Defense accounts and into somebody else's. A battalion of that size does not pay for everything through a central procurement portal. Some transactions are still handled the old way, by cheque, drawn on an impressed account and signed by an authorized officer. To keep operations moving when officers are deployed or on exercise, a small number of cheques in each book are pre-signed in advance. Those blank cheques then live in a locked drawer, inside a locked office, on a garrison protected by armed sentries. The system depends entirely on the person holding the key. The pre-signed cheques are numbered. Each cheque is supposed to be logged in a register, matched to an invoice, and posted with a stub explaining who the payment went to and why. Any staff sergeant in the Corps could recite the procedure by heart. Andrew Oakes helped write parts of the local standing orders that governed it. There were audits, there were reconciliations, there were quarterly reviews. But the reviews trusted the register, and the register trusted the man filling it in. If the stub said the money went to a regimental accountant or a tailoring firm, that is what the audit recorded. No one photocopied the cheques. No one cross-checked the payee names against the actual bank statements returned from the clearinghouse, not in real time. The system was built on one simple assumption. The staff sergeant sitting at that desk, the man the Army had spent nearly 2 decades training and promoting, would not steal from his own battalion. The offending began in February 2021, before he ever touched the checkbook. That month, Andrew Oakes wanted a mortgage. He was on a staff sergeant's pay, which is a respectable wage, but nothing that unlocks the kind of property he had in mind. So he sat down at a laptop and forged a set of bank statements showing a balance of over £300,000 in savings. He told colleagues, and later his mortgage broker, that he had won something he called an Army lottery. There is no such thing. There has never been an Army lottery. But he said it with the confidence of a man who had spent 17 years inside the institution, and people, including at least one financial professional whose job it was to check, did not press him on it. The mortgage went through. The lie held. 2 years passed. In 2023, he claimed £1,584 in mileage allowance, based on a residential address in Cheshire, supported by fabricated council tax bills and utility bills bearing that address. He was not, in fact, commuting from Cheshire. He was living in service accommodation at the garrison, a few minutes' walk from his desk. The mileage was a fiction. The paperwork was a Photoshop job. It cleared. By this point, something had shifted. Small frauds, cleanly executed, breed larger ones. In December 2023, Andrew Oakes reached into the locked drawer, opened the pre-signed checkbook, and wrote the first check to himself. The method was patient and precise. He would write a check, made payable to A. Oakes, and deposit it into his personal account. Then he would return to the register, and he would either tear the corresponding stub out of the book entirely or rewrite it in a different hand, listing a real supplier as the recipient, a regimental accountant, a local tailoring firm, companies the battalion actually did business with, companies whose invoices, if anyone ever pulled them, would exist and add up in roughly the right ballpark. Over the next 10 months, he did this 28 times. The individual checks ranged from a few £1,000s to 5-figure sums. The total, when investigators eventually added it up, came to £336,448. He spent the money in ways that were, in retrospect, almost cinematically easy to trace. 3 Teslas, a Model 3, a Model Y, a Model S, a BMW Mini, a Nissan Qashqai, Apple products, according to the prosecution, in quantities more consistent with a small electronics retailer than a household, a hair transplant at a private clinic, roughly £16,555 on what the court file politely called adult services. And the rest disappeared into personal debts he had built up in the years before the checkbook came within reach. No one on the audit team noticed. No one at the clearing bank flagged the pattern, and no one in the battalion, walking past the Tesla in the car park with the staff sergeant behind the wheel, seems to have said out loud what several of them later admitted they had wondered privately. Where on earth is the money coming from? What finally cracked it open was not the cars. It was the leave. Between the start of the check fraud and its discovery, Andrew Oakes took 66 days of medical leave. On top of that, He took 12 days of compassionate leave, granted on the basis of a family bereavement. Compassionate leave in the British Army is not handed out casually. It requires a request through the chain of command. It requires an officer, somewhere, to look a soldier in the eye and decide that this man needs to be at home with his family right now, and that the unit will cover his duties in his absence. His officers looked him in the eye. They granted the leave. They rearranged shift patterns and doubled up workloads and told him to take whatever time he needed. Some of them believed they were attending a funeral. He was not at a funeral. He was collecting a car. He was at an appointment. He was doing the things a man with a great deal of stolen money and a limited window in which to spend it does. By spring 2024, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore inside the finance cell. Colleagues were quietly asking why Sergeant Oakes was absent so often, and why every absence seemed to correspond to a period when a specific type of paperwork went untouched until his return. Someone, and the MoD has never publicly named who, walked a concern up the chain. In May 2024, the concern reached a level where it could not be walked back down. An internal check was ordered on the impressed checkbook. The register was pulled. The bank statements from the clearinghouse were requested. And for the first time, someone at Catterick Garrison sat down and matched the two documents against each other, check by check, stub by stub. The stub said one thing. The clearinghouse said another. The clearinghouse said A. Oakes. A. Oakes. A. Oakes. We are about to get into the moment this all came apart, and I want to say something before we do. Cases like this one, where a serving soldier steals from his own battalion, do not get the coverage they deserve. If you want to see more accountability content, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We cover these stories properly, and the ending on this one lands hard. The case was passed to the Ministry of Defense Economic Crime Team, a specialist unit that investigates fraud, theft, and corruption inside the armed forces and the MoD civilian workforce. They are, in effect, the accountants with warrant cards. They started with the checkbook. Then they went to the bank. Every one of the 28 checks was pulled and photographed front and back. On the reverse side, in the endorsement box, was a signature. Andrew Oakes, every time. Deposited into a personal account in his name, at a high street bank, at branches close to the garrison or close to his Winsford address. They pulled his bank statements. They cross-referenced deposits against check numbers. They built a spreadsheet showing every check, the date it was written, the date it cleared, and what happened to the money in the days that followed. They mapped it against DVLA records for the vehicles, against invoices from a private hair transplant clinic, against subscription records for the escort services listed under the euphemism that would eventually appear in the sentencing remarks. They also pulled his mortgage file. The forged bank statements from February 2021 were still there, sitting in a broker's compliance folder, 3 years old and now radioactive. The picture that emerged was almost tidy. A man who had committed a small, careful fraud in 2021 to get on the property ladder, a slightly less careful fraud in 2023 for a few £100s of mileage, and then, in December of that year, an industrial-scale fraud built directly on the trust of a staff sergeant's posting. The MoD team interviewed his colleagues. Some of them cried. One senior soldier reportedly said, in a formal statement, that he had personally covered Oakes's duties on the day he thought Oakes was burying a relative. That relative, investigators established, had not died. The compassionate leave story collapsed. The bereavement story collapsed. The Army lottery story collapsed. What was left was a set of numbers and a checkbook. The arrest took place at his address in Winsford. Investigators had a warrant. They had the paperwork. They had, by that point, more evidence than they strictly needed. He was taken to a police station in North Yorkshire and interviewed under caution. The interview, according to court reporting, was measured. There was no shouting. There was no denial in the conventional sense. There was, instead, the quiet exhaustion of a man who had been running a spreadsheet in his head for nearly a year and had just been shown the real one. Investigator: Sergeant Oakes, Can you explain the checks made payable to yourself from the impressed account? Oakes: I know what this looks like. Investigator: That isn't an answer. Oakes: I know. They asked him about the compassionate leave. He looked at the table. He did not answer for a long moment. Investigator: Was there a bereavement? Oakes: Not the way I told them. Investigator: Was there a bereavement at all? Oakes: No, not like that. No. They asked about the Army lottery. He said, quietly, that he had made it up. They asked how he had thought this would end. He said he had not thought that far ahead. Before the interview closed, he made one request. He asked whether his colleagues at the battalion had been told. The investigator confirmed that they had. He put his hands on the table, palms flat, and said nothing else for the rest of the session. Andrew Oakes was charged with 3 counts of fraud by false representation, 1 count of fraud by abuse of a position of trust, and 1 count of acquiring criminal property. He pleaded guilty to all 5. The sentencing took place at Teesside Crown Court on the 12th of June 2025, before Judge Nathan Adams. The prosecution set out the numbers in cold sequence. £336,448 diverted from the Ministry of Defense, 28 government checks, 3 Teslas, a BMW Mini, a Nissan Qashqai, Apple products, a hair transplant, £16,555 on adult services, 66 days of medical leave, 12 days of compassionate leave, granted on the basis of a bereavement that had not occurred. Defense counsel emphasized the guilty plea, the cooperation with investigators, and what he described as genuine remorse. He asked the court to consider Oakes's 17 years of otherwise unblemished service. Judge Adams was not moved to leniency. He described the post at Catterick as prestigious and high responsibility. He described the pre-signed checkbook as an instrument of trust that Oakes had converted into an instrument of theft. He turned briefly to the question of the compassionate leave. He said that the officers who had granted that leave had done so in good faith. He said that the colleagues who had covered those duties had done so out of respect for a soldier they believed was grieving. He said that the damage to the morale of that unit was, in his view, a serious aggravating factor. He sentenced Andrew Oakes to 3 years and 6 months in prison. A Proceeds of Crime Act hearing was scheduled to follow, at which the court will attempt to recover what remains of the £336,000. Given the depreciation on 3 Teslas, a hair transplant, and £16,000 of adult services, the recovery is not expected to be complete. He was taken down from the dock in a suit rather than a uniform. The Army had already begun administrative discharge proceedings. His rank, his career, his pension entitlements, and the trust of every colleague who had ever signed a piece of paper on his behalf were gone before the cell door closed behind him. The staff sergeant the battalion had trusted with its money spent it on cars he could not keep, on services he could not talk about, and on a version of himself he could not sustain. The colleagues who had covered his shifts, who had grieved with him for a relative who was not dead, went back to work the next morning. This case was calculated, but the case on the right-hand side of your screen right now is on a completely different scale. Click it now.